back, everybody. So this is the third day of the lecture series, and quite likely the last day for the Oxford gang to agree to come because the time. Okay, so let me. So I don't think I need to introduce Alex again. So this is the second day that Alex will give a presentation. So we are very happy to have him back. Okay, so and let's just go straight to his lecture. So please, Alex, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Fuhito. Again, thanks to you, Chiro Kamada, and Michi Kandori for organizing this and inviting us. And as Fuhito said, this is my second lecture in this series of 4 lectures. And this is now joint work with the names you will hopefully already find familiar, which is Elizabeth Bolden and Paul Klemperer, who are online and at Oxford, Ravi Jagadisan, who we've mentioned several times, who is currently a postdoc at Stanford, and also with Omar Edhan, who is at Manchester. And this, the title of this work is the Equilibrium Existence Duality, Equilibrium with Indivisibilities and Income Effects. And what I want to do in this lecture is to sort of try to answer some of the questions I left at the end of my first lecture. So I'll give you a quick reminder of that was. And then also connect it, probably briefly, because both Elizabeth and I have discovered that time runs very quickly when you're giving a lecture in Tokyo. So I will briefly mention the connection of this work also to Elizabeth's lecture yesterday on demand types and unimodularity. So let me give you a quick reminder about why this team of lecturers and many others, of course, many people on this call find markets for indivisible goods to be very important. Of course, we have a wonderful theory of markets for divisible goods, general equilibrium, but in many cases, indivisibilities turn out to be very important. And examples of this kind of come from exchange economies like housing markets or markets for used cars, auctions, of course, which Elizabeth talked about in detail yesterday. And the first example of really where indivisibilities played an important role in both the kind of modeling and from a practical point of view was in spectrum auctions, and they still continue to do so. So spectrum auctions still drive a lot of the agenda for markets with indivisible goods, but also ad auctions of the kind that you see on Google. And a little bit maybe less obvious, but nevertheless still served as an inspiration for a lot of the earlier papers on markets with indivisibles is labor markets. So when we think about specialized jobs, perhaps of high-flying academics or people on executive boards, these jobs tend to be very specialized and heterogeneous and quite indivisible, very difficult to split up a CEO's time. So what I mentioned in the first lecture, and I spent about an hour on this on this very small bullet point, is that most previous work on indivisible goods assume transferable utility, essentially for tractability. And as you saw, you can get remarkable tractability by assuming transferable utility, or in other words, assuming that agents' utility functions are quasi-linear. And in particular, you can get very beautiful conditions for existence of equilibrium. So we saw the kinds of conditions that were introduced by Kelso and Crawford and Gulen-Stiketty, which say, for example, that the agent's valuations satisfy the substitutes condition. You saw the kind of conditions of Bikhchandani, Mama, and Ma, which give sort of necessary and sufficient conditions in a kind of linear programming sense for existence of equilibrium. And you also saw the Sun and Yang's condition, which was that you can split up the goods into two sets where there are substitutes inside and complements across. And yesterday, of course, you saw this marvelous lecture by Elizabeth where she took this idea of thinking about not just substitutes as a kind of as a condition for existence, but actually much further than that, and showed you, in fact, that you can get very rich preferences described by demand types that are still going to give you, still going to guarantee existence of equilibrium. So you can get a lot of mileage is really the bottom line here. But as I argued towards the end of my first lecture, the moment you think that indivisibles really need to be indivisible inside the model, then you sort of question that assumption of transferable utility a bit. And in particular, if a good really needs to be indivisible inside the model, it's very likely that the indivisible good is large in some sense. And so whenever the indivisibility is itself important, then what you are likely to then also have to assume alongside that is that some kind of income effect or financing constraint is also going to be important. So if the indivisible good is in fact large as possible, that buying this indivisible good is going to potentially make the agent run into trouble with their budget, or make them feel very upset about being left with too little money at the end. But it turns out that as soon as you start introducing income effects, existence of equilibrium becomes quite tricky, right? So we talked about the example of the housing market in the first lecture, where agents simply require one house, or they want at most one house, but they care about how much money they're left with at the end of this as well. And suddenly it turned out that even that model, existence of equilibrium, was by no means straightforward and required quite sophisticated arguments compared to the simpler, more constructive arguments you can sometimes use in the world with transferable utility, especially if you assume something like the substitutability condition. So what I want to do in this lecture is to analyze markets for indivisible goods with income effects, because this seems like a natural marriage of assumptions. And the way that I will do it is by isolating, and this will sound very familiar, the roles of income and substitution effects. So this is something that we do a lot in the standard consumer theory model that we teach to our undergraduates and indeed to our graduates, kind of basic canon of microeconomic theory. And it turns out this separation, which is usually captured in the divisible goods case by the Slutsky equation, this turns out to be extremely powerful for analysis of equilibrium, actually, in markets with indivisible goods. So that's the plan. And let me be a little bit more precise about what I'm going to do. And the first thing I will do is to separate those income and substitution effects by using the somewhat, if you like, less thought about type of demand, which is called Hicksian demand. And I will be more precise about what this is. Almost certainly, if you've ever taken an undergraduate or graduate microeconomic theory sequence, you would have come across Hicksian demand. You will have seen it in your Slutsky equation, and it's going to be the solutions to the agent's expenditure minimization problem. And it turns out that Hicksian demand, rather than the more standard Marshallian demand, which is the solutions to the utility maximization problem, is what's going to play the kind of key and central role here. And I think it's probably worth saying that at least 3 authors on this paper derived great pleasure from that fact, because John Hicks, of course, spent his career at Oxford rather than Marshall, who spent his career at Cambridge. And then what we'll do, and this will be a more unusual move, very specific to this paper, is we will combine Hicksian demands of each agent to form what we call a Hicksian economy. And in this Hicksian economy, what we're going to do is we're going to hold the utility level as fixed, rather than holding the endowments in fixed. And this I will show you more precisely how. It's going to turn off the income effects. So in our usual formulation of an economy, when we're looking for competitive equilibrium, we fix endowments as given, and we say agents go forth and maximize your utility and report back your Marshallian demand. Here we will hold utility levels fixed, and it will say agents go forth and report your Hicksian demand. And by turning off these income effects, we will basically observe a transferable utility economy. And this will then allow us to state the next result, which is the one that's going to play the most important role in this paper. And this is what we call the equilibrium existence duality. And it will turn out that equilibrium will exist in the original economy, in the one we're actually interested in, the one where agents report their Marshallian demand, if and only if it always exists in each Hicksian economy. And this might seem like a kind of abstract result, it's sort of a mapping between equilibria in one economy and equilibria in another economy. But because these Hicksian economies turn out to be transferable utility economies, what will happen is that we will be able to get a lot of mileage, not just in terms of explaining how previous results work, but also in terms of generating new results. So in particular, one of the things that this result tells us, and this might run somewhat counter to the title of the paper I'm presenting, is that it's not really the income effects themselves that play the key role in determining whether equilibrium exists. It's really the substitution effects that are going to be described by Hicksian demands and that are going to be doing all the action in the Hicksian economies that are going to determine whether equilibrium exists. And to be a little bit more precise, what I mean by that is that any condition for existence can essentially be written in terms of substitution effects alone. So if you give me a condition for existence, I can either write that condition or a weaker condition for existence in terms of substitution effects alone. So you know, all the action really happens around the substitution effects. And so, as I said, while this is an interesting, perhaps conceptual point, it's also exciting to be able to use this result to generate completely new domains for existence, which have not been really analyzed and thought about before. And in this talk, you will see a lot of pictures that look a bit like this. So there will be arrows that look like that, and I will explain to you how this picture works maybe a couple of times. But the way to read it is to really start at the bottom left of this diagram, where we have a condition that might look familiar, like substitutability in the transferable utility economy. Sometimes, and I've avoided this name, sometimes called gross substitutability in the transferable utility economy. I've avoided this specifically. I'll come back to this. There's no reason to say gross if an agent has quasi-linear utility. So we'll just call it substitutability. And as you recall, this condition gives us by the theorems of Kelso and Crawford or Gould and Stigeti, gives us equilibrium existence in a transferable utility economy. Now, what we'll do is we'll do sort of two moves to generate new results. The first move is going to be this quasi-linear interpretation of Hicksian demand. So as I said, we're going to use Hicksian demand to create this new condition. This is going from the bottom left corner to the bottom right corner. And this will give us this new condition on preferences. And in this world, this condition is called net substitutability. As you might recall, most conditions on Hicksian demand are conditions that begin with the word net, right, rather than gross. Conditions on Marshallian demand are typically called gross substitutes, gross complements. Conditions on Hicksian demand are called net substitutes, net complements, etc. And then the thing to observe is going from the top left corner to the top right corner. And it is that by the equilibrium existence duality, it means that we know that if an equilibrium exists for all utility levels in the economy which satisfies the substitutability condition, we then know that the equilibrium will exist for all endowments in the economy in which agents' preferences satisfy net substitutability. And so indeed, net substitutability will turn out to be this new sufficient condition for existence of equilibrium. Now, we can actually do more than that, because the equilibrium existence duality goes in both directions. you can use the necessary direction of the equilibrium existence duality to then prove maximal domain results. And then it will also turn out that a net substitutability, in particular, among others, forms a maximal domain of preferences for existence of equilibrium in the world with income effects. So more generally, I can take any transferable utility result or any result on existence of equilibrium in a transferable utility economy, and I gave you many in the first lecture, and I'll be able to extend it to a setting with income effects and give a precise formulation of what that result actually looks like in the setting with income effects. And some of these are going to generate completely novel insights. But you know, it's probably worth emphasizing substitutability, as I had done in the first lecture and Elizabeth did in her lecture, such a kind of canonical condition. And so we're very happy to be able to say something a bit new even here. So just want to quickly, very quickly, perhaps, talk about the relationship of this paper to the other papers. And all of these, except perhaps the last one, which I haven't mentioned in a lot of detail because I knew Elizabeth would, is to mention the work on indivisible goods and income effects. So I mentioned that there's been work, some actually already quite old, you know, as far back as the 80s, analyzing settings in which there were income effects and indivisible goods. And so there's work by Kaneko Yamamoto, Van der Laan and co-authors, and Zaifu Yang, and these sort of assumed some condition that looked a bit like separability, which you know, gives you nice clean results, but perhaps is a little bit strong. This kind of one type of papers. The other type of papers I mentioned is papers that assume gross substitutability. So here now, because I have income effects, I need to specify that really it's gross substitutability. And in particular, Tomasz Fleiner, Zsuzsi Janko, Ravi, and I had a paper where we showed in quite a general setting what happens when you have gross substitutability and income effects. And in fact, I guess it's probably fair to say two things. One is that actually, in terms of the analysis, it still looks quite similar to some of the work in transferable utility. But also, as we discussed in the first lecture, actually gross substitutability is actually a very strong condition when you have income effects. And I gave you a sort of an intuition for why that might be the case. If you're a buyer in particular, gross substitutability condition pulls you into two different directions. Substitutability condition tells you that demand of the goods whose price doesn't change should be going up. And then the income effect naturally tells you that it should be going down if you have normal goods. And so it seems to kind of really pin you down into only having inferior goods. And so this is, again, seems quite restrictive. Then there was the work in exchange economies. So the work I've just mentioned now is really all done in matching markets. The work in exchange economies, as you recall, hopefully, this is in a very simple setting. Agents demand at most one house. And I'm going to come back to this model because it will allow me to connect it to some of the things I talked about in the first lecture. And there were, as I said, 3 papers remarkably all in 1 year, giving slightly different variations on the same result, and with 3 completely different proofs, actually, which is, I think, really, really nice, of existence of equilibrium in this setting. And again, you can't use a nice constructive argument. All of them use different topological arguments for existence. And then the last a paper I want to mention, which Elizabeth had already mentioned before, extraordinarily overlooked paper, but a remarkable paper. And if you're interested in this topic, at some point, I think you should open this paper and see it and read it for yourself, because it's really, it was so far ahead of its time. Remarkably enough, even this paper covers the case with income effects. So it both, as Elizabeth already said yesterday, introduced this unimodularity condition, but it also actually covered the setting with income effects as well. As Elizabeth said, it's actually quite hard to tell exactly what the economic conditions are and exactly how to interpret it. So it's not surprising that there was follow-up work that didn't really fully appreciate this paper. But nevertheless, it's worth giving credit to it. And right at the very end, I'll come back and I will show you exactly how we can combine the results from this paper with what Elizabeth showed yesterday to actually give an immediate proof of the results in this paper. Any questions before I move on and tell you about the model? It was a very relaxing introduction, I feel, but hopefully it's worthwhile because maybe not everyone had listened to the first two lectures. Okay, great. Right, well, then I'll tell you what the model is. And I think this time round, I'm going to be a little bit more precise. So Michi asked a question in the first lecture about more precise conditions about what we were assuming. And I said, let me brush a bunch of things under the carpet. I will try to keep the carpet completely away from the floor now, so you should be able to see all the moving parts. But of course, please clarify if anything at all is unclear. So as before, we have finite set I of indivisible goods and money, which is going to be our numeraire, and a finite set J of agents. So hopefully you're now by now used to this notation. We are also going to denote by X sub J sub I the feasible the set of feasible consumption bundles of indivisible goods. And now here I'm going to introduce a new bit of notation. And it is this x underscore 0, and that's going to be the minimum level of consumption of numeraire. Okay, this is going to be new notation. This is going to be this this kind of constraint, and so the feasible consumption bundles are now going to be some amount of money and a consumption bundle that's going to come from this set of feasible consumption bundles of indivisible. So I'll have some money and some indivisible goods. Yep.
Very minor clarifying question. So the feasible set for money is an open set. Is there any reason for that?
Michi, you are too quick, and it is frankly terrifying presenting anything in front of you. Yes, this is absolutely deliberate, and I'm going to give you an entire slide's worth of explanation about this. So okay, this is deliberately an open consumption set, and I think this is an example to everybody. Really Michi's question about looking at conditions very carefully. So yes, this is completely deliberate. And so let me actually explain why this is the case. This open bracket is supposed to be there. Thank you very much indeed. And here we are. So this is really the explanation. So as I said, this X underscore, this U bit of notation is the minimum level consumption numeraire. Our utility function is going to take a consumption bundle and spit out a utility level, right? And we can have it in principle be bounded or unbounded. The first thing I'm going to assume is that utility is continuous and strictly increasing in money, which is relatively mild and uncontroversial. But the more important part related to Michi's question is the following. So I'm going to assume that as money is going to tend to the lower bound, the utility level is going to tend to the lower bound as well. So as the money is approaching the minimum level of consumption of money, utility is going to go down to its also to its minimum level. And I guess less controversially, as utility is going to go as money is going to go to infinity, as I give you an infinite amount of money, their utility is going to tend to the upper level of money, the U upper bar. Now, the more important part of this assumption is the first one, and it is the one that is related to Michi's question most importantly. And in particular, what it says is that the agent is not allowed to, if you like, to hit that lower bound. So that consumption set is indeed open. And in particular, and this is the key economic consequence of this, is that in this paper, we're going to rule out hard budget constraints. So the reason for doing that is very simple. And, elementary example with 2-3 agents kill off equilibrium if you have indivisible goods and budget constraints. And the reason for that is that when you have a budget constraints coupled with indivisible goods, you're going to generate discontinuity of demand. And as soon as demand is discontinuous, equilibrium is going to stop existing. So I'm going to rule out hard budget constraints. Now here, I'm still allowing for income effects, as I'll show you in a moment, but I will only allow for soft budget constraints, perhaps at a financing constraints. And I think that's probably quite reasonable in many contexts, right? So of course, we're very used to analyzing problems with hard budget constraints because they don't pose any trouble when you have divisible goods. They don't create discontinuity. But in many contexts, so if I think, for example, about a spectrum auction, while it is certainly true that if the spectrum auction is large, firms might run into financing problems buying spectrum, it's also probably reasonable to say that they don't have a hard budget constraints. Financing might become more expensive as the cost of the bundle goes up, but it seems like a firm can typically just go to a bank and sort of try to borrow, right? And so as long as borrowing is possible, even if it becomes costly, it will be covered by this model. Is this okay, Michi? Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I understand the notion of hard versus soft budget constraint. Are you going to give us formal definitions?
I won't. So actually, everything that's written here is really all that I want to do. So the only distinction I want to give is that this definition, I will say, captures a soft budget constraint. So I'm allowed, financing becomes harder. It becomes, as I approach the budget constraints, things become very bad, right? But there's still a budget constraint present. I will say, and this will be covered in Ravi's lecture tomorrow, we'll have a different assumption that it will allow you to actually hit the budget constraint. You're allowed to be actually on the...
In any case, we are going to see the formal definition of soft and hard budget.
So I don't think we actually ever wrote down a formal definition of one or the other in either paper, but this is just the interpretation of the condition. So tomorrow, Ravi will give us...
What's the idea? I still don't understand what you mean by hard and soft budget constraint.
So by hard budget constraint, I mean that you have a budget constraint and you're allowed to basically be on the budget constraint. Whereas a soft budget constraint, I say, okay, you become unhappy when you approach the budget constraint, but you're never really on the budget constraint. So as I said, financing becomes more and more expensive as you approach the budget constraint. So this is covered by this model here.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Can I ask you?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, I see. It seems still say the existence of minimal level x0 underbar sounds like a hard budget constraint because the amount of money you can use is limited.
That's correct. So perhaps my terminology is not ideal, but I think the key thing to distinguish it from the lecture that's going to be tomorrow morning, Tokyo time, is that here I'm not allowed to be on the budget constraint. Here I'm not allowed to be on the budget constraint. Tomorrow I will be allowed to be on the budget constraint. So in GE, we typically allow for hard budget constraints.
Yes,
the agent usually ends up while they when they utility maximize, they end up being on their constraint. Here, I'm saying you can't actually be on the constraint. So the constraint is there, but it's soft in the sense that it's not really, it's in principle not a kind of interacting directly with the agent's utility function. Right? But yes, in a way, you can also say this is also a hard budget constraint. You can interpret it this way.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
I don't think formally we're saying anything more than on your previous slide, Alex, which is
that's correct.
An open interval versus a closed interval.
That's exactly right. So everything formally has already been stated. Everything else that I've said in terms of hard and soft budget constraint is just our interpretation. So if you think that this language isn't ideal, I would be delighted. If you can give us a kind of a better way of explaining it, I would be really grateful. Because if this is already confusing, then we're not doing a very good job at explaining it. But thank you for these comments, and we'll take note. Maybe we can also discuss the best terminology offline. So I hope at least the formal definition is clear. And so let me give you some examples of the kind of preferences we can cover. So if you set the minimum level of consumption of money at negative infinity, you can recover quasi-linear preferences, which we had seen a lot of. And you've already seen this function in the first lecture, and of course in Elizabeth's lecture as well. And it simply looks like this. So agent's utility is a valuation of a bundle of indivisible goods plus some amount of money. And this valuation is going to crop up again. And so this is going to be a function that takes a bundle of indivisible, spits out some real number. Okay, so this is familiar. And so we want to make sure we actually cover the case of quasi-linear preferences, but we can do better than that. We can do more general preferences than that. And one particular class that is really nice, and I will come back to it towards the end of the lecture, and it turns out to be attractive, both in terms of analysis, but also geometrically, is going to what we call quasi-logarithmic utility. So it's, you'll see in a moment why that's the case. I'm going to set the minimum level of consumption of money at 0, yeah, which is, you know, reasonably kind of a common bound. And the preferences are going to look like this. So the utility function is going to be log of money plus some function some function f, essentially. And this function is going to, I'll give an example of what this function can look like, but the kind of key point here is that as the amount of money that you have goes to 0, it's going to take the utility function to negative infinity. And as the amount of money goes to infinity, it's going to take the utility function to infinity. So this is an example of where things get very bad for the agent as you approach the minimum level of consumption of money. Okay, and this is basically all captured by that log. So I'll give you a more precise form for function f later on, but this turns out to be very nice to work with because money and the function that specifies, if you like, the sort of valuation, as it were, yeah, it's still separable. So that makes things nice. Okay,
Alex.
Yeah.
So is this an example? This log money utility function is an example of soft budget constraint model.
Yes, exactly right.
So suppose I have this utility and my endowment is 5 units of money. And then I maximize my utility, taking market prices as given. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that I'm just on the budget constraint. So why I'm off the budget constraint if I have this utility function?
So you have 5 units of money originally, so you can go all the way down to 0.
Yeah.
That's your endowment. So you can go towards 0, and you're going to become very unhappy when you're spending this money, right?
Yeah. So that's not my utility maximization.
Right.
Consumption plan. If I choose my consumption plan optimally, the amount of money I consume is strictly positive, and I'm just on the budget constraint. So
I'm not sure why you say that. So. Okay, but
again, I think Alex, it's a confusion between 2 different terms of budget constraint. There's the budget constraint we typically talk about, where we are maximizing subject to a budget constraint. And Michi's quite right, we will be on that budget constraint. But additionally, we have the X0, which is the amount of money we cannot go below.
Yeah.
So perhaps calling that the budget constraint, given that there is another standard meaning of budget constraint in microeconomics,
is not helpful.
Oh, so
yeah.
it's not budget constraint, but it's feasibility of consumption.
It's a feasibility constraint.
It's all about feasibility. We're
Okay.
simply giving
Okay,
interpretation.
not budget
In your
constraint.
example,
It's
Michi,
soft,
I
softer
start out with
feasibility
5.
versus harder feasibility. Maybe a better term. Okay,
Anyway,
but
sorry,
I sort of
Kojima.
understand what you are trying to say.
So in the example that you gave, I start out with £5 and I'm allowed to spend anything up to £5, but not actually £5. That's what I would do optimally, right? And so you're perfectly right that it's probably using hard budget constraints is maybe not the best way of explaining it.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Now it's clear. Yeah.
In fact, it's on Alex's original slide. You wrote feasible consumption bundles.
Yeah.
And
So
you had an open interval. Yes, and that is the complete formal definition.
Good.
And you have an open interval and not a closed one.
Yeah. So this is
That's fine,
exactly the parentheses that you mentioned, Michi. Yeah. Okay. So we'll work on that. Thank you very much. Okay, great. So hopefully this example is clear and this discussion was helpful. And so let me then now move to the distinction between Michelian and Hicksian demands. So how do we define Michelian demand? This is standard. We say we take an endowment and we take prices as given. And we spit out the Michelian demand will spit out the bundle that is going to maximize the agent's utility. Now you can look at an equivalent formulation. You can say I'm going to take utility level as given and a price vector, and then given that utility level, I'm going to check which bundles are going to minimize the agent's expenditure in order to get to that utility level. And so you might remember when you were doing microeconomic theory basics, you would either fix the budget constraint and move your utility function as high up as possible. That's what the Michelian demand really tells you. Alternatively, you can also fix the indifference curve and then move the expenditure as low as you can. In particular, what we show in this indivisible good context is under our assumptions that a bundle of goods is expenditure minimizing if and only if it is utility maximizing. Okay. Now, one thing to mention, and then just because this has already come up in the first lecture, is that if we have quasi-linear preferences, the choice of your favorite bundle is not going to depend on your endowment. So in particular, the bundle that you pick is just going to depend on the prices. And so instead of calling it Michelian or Hicksian or using terms like net and gross, we can simply say that it is demand, which is a function of prices, and it's the bundle that maximizes my valuation of the bundle minus the expenditure on this bundle. Okay, so this is hopefully exactly as we saw in Elizabeth's lecture yesterday. Now, so here is the first kind of conceptual move that we want to make. So we want to fix a utility level and think about the amount of money that we need in order to be able to get to that utility level, given a particular bundle of indivisibles that an agent has. So fix an indivisible bundle, pick a utility level. How much money do you need to be able to reach that utility level when you're holding that bundle of indivisibles? Okay, now I want to take a negative of that. And this is what we call a Hicksian valuation. Okay, now you will see that this Hicksian valuation is not really a valuation. Okay, it's this amount of money that we need. Now, this Hicksian valuation is a little bit of perhaps a strange object, but actually it has come up under different names in prior work. So Demonge and Gale called the negative of the Hicksian valuation the compensation function. This is how much the agent needs to be compensated in order to be able to reach that utility level U. And it turns out a lot of their analysis was also done using this function. It also appears in Danilov, Kojima, and Morota. But in our case, it's going to play a very central role for a reason I'm about to show you. And also, hopefully, it will explain why the name is the way that it is. So here you, please note, I've denoted it VJ_H, okay, for Hicksian valuation. Now, it turns out, and this is, you know, a one-line proof kind of result, that you can rewrite Hicksian demand over here. Now, remember, it's _H for Hicksian, as a quasi-linear maximization problem where the Hicksian valuation is that first term. Okay, so rather than thinking about, as before, the standard definition of Hicksian demand says fix a utility level and minimize your cost, what you can do is you can basically write down that definition and then sort of substitute into the constraint and just rewrite this essentially as this quasi-linear maximization problem, but not with a valuation, rather with this Hicksian valuation as the first term. Okay, now, as far as we can tell, this result would not have any consequences for standard analysis with divisible goods. I think it's maybe kind of just, you know, conceptually interesting, but it really doesn't tell you very much, right? But it turns out to play a crucial role for the results that I'm about to show you. So in particular, what's nice about looking at the Hicksian valuation as this object is that Hicksian valuations are going to fully capture substitution effects. So as you can see that what the Hicksian demand does, it turns off the income effect, it fixes the utility level, and it captures the substitution effect. So the Hicksian valuation does exactly the same thing. So if you want to get to income effects, what you then need to do is to vary the utility level. So the variations in the utility level are going to tell you what the income effects are. And at a fixed utility level, the Hicksian valuation is going to tell you what the substitution effects are. Okay. Now, the fact that the Hicksian demand can be rewritten in this nice quasi-linear form turns out to be really important for the analysis with indivisible goods. So why is that? So let me take you sort of slowly through this slide. So as I said, as before, we're going to denote for a fixed utility level a Hicksian valuation by V sub H. And then I'm going to do the following thing. I'm going to say fix a profile of utility levels, right? And then ask each agent to pick their expenditure minimizing bundle. Now, by the lemma on the previous slide, we know that this is equivalent to an agent solving a quasi-linear maximization problem with the Hicksian valuation as the first term. Now, this means that this quote unquote Hicksian economy in which the utility levels are fixed is a transferable utility economy in which each agent's valuation is in fact their Hicksian valuation, right? Entirely because of that lemma before. So because we also know that bundles are expenditure minimizing as if and only if they're from the previous lemma, the kind of the last thing that we also know is that if a bundle is picked in that Hicksian economy, this means that this bundle is also picked by the agent with their Hicksian demand in the original economy, and also, in fact, by the equivalence between expenditure minimization and utility maximization, it's also picked by their Marshallian demand in the original economy. But what's very nice about the Hicksian economy is that it's a transferable utility economy about which we know a lot of things. And it's an economy in which there are no income effects at all. And in fact, the only thing that is really happening in that economy is just substitution effects. So if you think about a general price effect that captures both income and substitution effects, in the Hicksian economy, you do not see the income effect. Utility levels are fixed. So all you observe is substitution effects. Okay.
Alex?
Yeah.
What are the supply or endowment of the Hicksian economy?
So
If you talk about the equilibrium, there should be supply
so
of goods, right?
you're always a slider to ahead, Michi. So I haven't talked about endowments yet. Now, of course, as I said, the Hicksian economy is a TU economy, right? So here actually endowments are not going to play a central role, right?
No. If you don't have an endowment, you can't really, pin down prices.
Indeed. So I'm going to come to this in a moment. So I'll show you exactly what the endowment is, and then I will go between the two.
Okay, I'll wait.
Yeah, perfect. So we can also, of course, define a Hicksian economy. It's going to be less useful, but we can also start with an actual transferable utility economy in which agents have quasi-linear preferences, and then develop a Hicksian economy for that setting. But actually it will just be essentially equivalent, ordinary equivalent to the original economy. So where the Hicksian economy is going to look very different is going to be the case in which we do have income effects. And what it's going to do is going to turn off these income effects, convert the original economy into a transferable utility economy. Okay. Any more questions so far? So now I'm going to hopefully try to answer, in a moment, I'm going to answer Michik's question completely precisely. I'll just give you an example of the intuition of what the Hicksian economy is doing. So if you recall the first lecture, there are two types of models in which agents demand at most one good. So we had the assignment game where we had the buyers and the sellers, as you remember, and they had quasi-linear utility and they demanded at most one good. And we also have the housing market model in which agents also demand at most one. It's an exchange economy. Agents also at most demand one good, but we allow for income effects, right? Now, we already know these economies look completely different from the point of view of equilibrium. You can prove equilibrium in the assignment game by linear programming. In order to prove equilibrium in the housing market, it seems like you need to use topological arguments. And actually, if you think about how they relate from the point of view of original to Hicksian economy, it's immediate. In fact, if you start with the housing market and you take the quasi-linear interpretation of Hicksian demand and you think about Hicksian demand in the housing market economy with income effects, you fix the utility level. What in fact you get is an assignment game. It's an assignment game in which the valuations are Hicksian valuations of agents in the original economy. So in fact, there is a mapping between these two economies, right? But the demand to focus on should be Hicksian demand rather than Marshallian demand. Okay, so this is just to take this sort of abstraction of the Hicksian economy and to really show you how it operates on a specific example. And in a moment, I'll come back to this example. So now really to Michi's question. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is to fix the total endowment of goods in the economy. And what we want to do is to think about an endowment allocation, which is going to be an endowment for all the agents such that the endowments sum up to the total endowment exactly. Okay, so this is an endowment allocation. And then this gives us an equilibrium definition, which hopefully will look exactly the same as it did in the first lecture, except now I'm being formal about what an endowment is and what an endowment allocation is. So given an endowment for each agent, a competitive equilibrium is going to be a price vector and bundles for each agent. Now note, these are utility maximizing bundles because this is a standard definition of competitive equilibrium. And it's a price vector and bundles such that the bundles such that the market's clear for each good. This is what the last condition says. Is that if you take the utility maximizing bundles, it's going to be the case that markets are going to clear.
Alex,
okay? Yeah.
I'm slightly puzzled because I is the set of indivisible goods, right? So yeah. You're just looking at demand equals to supply for indivisible goods.
And then I've just got the last good
numeral.
End,
there should be an endowment of numeral. So, and you're talking about Marshallian demand. So there must be an equilibrium condition saying that demand for numeral good is equal to supply.
So there is
So
a,
that's the Wallace law or something?
exactly. So that's just by Walras law because I'm treating it as a numeraire, but there is an endowment of money as well, right? So it's captured over here, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. There.
So this is the one that I'm really
That'll be
keeping
the-
as a numeraire, right?
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So hopefully that sort of covers the question that you had before. So now I'm being completely precise about what the endowment is and competitive equilibrium. And here there is really, I hope, nothing that is controversial. I don't think there's anything at all to hide here. And so let me now state the key result. Of course, as I said before, in response to Michi's question, if you have transferable utility, equilibrium does not depend on endowment allocation. We've seen this in the first lecture. So here is our main result. Okay, it says the following: if an endowment allocation exists, it's very mild. Okay, it's just, can we actually find an endowment allocation? Then competitive equilibrium exists in each Hicksian economy for all utility levels, if and only if competitive equilibrium exists in the original economy for all endowment allocations. Okay, so it says that we can go between the equilibria in the Hicksian economy, a transferable utility economy, back and forth to the competitive equilibria in the original economy. So in particular, what this says that as far as existence of equilibrium is concerned, substitution effects are what are driving existence. Why? Because of the equivalence between the equilibria, there's also, it tells us that we should be able to switch off income effects completely and look at conditions for existence just in the Hicksian economies. Okay, so that's the main conceptual point, is that.
Okay,
Sorry,
so I'm very slow, so let me just try to understand. So you fix original economy, and the original economy come with the endowment for each agent, including numeral. Okay, so then you go to Hicksian economy, and in this Hicksian economy, you only have aggregate supply of divisible goods, and the amount of money allocated to the endowment of money for each consumer is endogenously determined by given utility profile.
That's a very impressive. Yeah. Okay.
So that's what you mean by Hicksian economy. So
that's correct.
You take the aggregate supply of divisible good, and you artificially fix, utility for each agent. And if everybody's utility is really high compared to small amount of, divisible good, you assume that many people have lots of money.
You
so
actually
that's the resulting.
So you're, I think, also hinting at actually how the proof of this result is going to work. It's actually the relationship between the utility levels and the expenditure in the original economy. I will show you this in a moment, but I think your intuition is exactly right.
Oh, I see. You don't have to talk about the allocation of money endowment in Hicksian economy if you talk about equilibrium. So you just look at demand equals to supply for divisible good. And that's the Hicksian
the utility level.
Exactly. Okay,
yeah.
Good. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So, so one direction of this I'm going to skip, and it's again very pleasingly for, I think, the Oxford crowd. This direction comes from the beautiful paper by Maskin and Roberts, which only came out in 2008, but it was originally written in 1980. And it is just the observation that the equilibria in the Hicksian economy look a little bit like quasi-equilibria with transfers. So going from competitive equilibria in the original economy to competitive equilibria in the Hicksian economy is not the interesting direction. The interesting direction is the one that was really hinted at by Michi's question, I think, as usual, one step ahead. And so let me show you how we can show the other direction, perhaps at least intuitively, maybe not with the full detail, but at least hopefully.
Alex, the other direction looks like Negishi's existence theorem.
That's an excellent question. So it's not like Negishi's existence.
Oh,
so
really?
we have a short explanation of that. So, so as you will see, our proof works by adjusting utility levels directly,
not the welfare weights.
That's not
Okay.
the welfare weights. Yeah, but you're absolutely right that Negishi's is probably this kind of outstanding example of when the existence was not done by Teytelboym prices, but by on another object. And as you said, on welfare weights.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in our case, it's going to be different. Okay, so this is the main technical contribution.
Excuse me.
Paper. Yeah.
May I ask you one brief question? So I don't know the definition of quasi-equilibria. So could you briefly explain what it is?
So let's, so quasi-equilibria, in a quasi-equilibrium, we are simply looking at agents who are minimizing their expenditure, right? So a quasi-equilibrium, in a competitive equilibrium, agents maximize their utility. In a quasi-equilibrium, agents minimize their expenditure.
Okay.
So that's why they look so similar. Yeah. Right. So you will see this definition is standard. It's even in Mascalel. So. Great. So let me just kind of give you an idea of how this other side of the proof works. So what do we need to do? And this is again so close to Michi's comment. So what we need to do is we start with some utility levels in the Higgsfield economy. And what we need to do is we need to adjust them in such a way that the agent's expenditure is going to be equal to their money endowment. Okay. Now, if we can find such a profile of utility levels, that's going to give us equilibrium in the original economy. Okay, so we start with some utility levels. They might be all over the place, as Michi pointed out. They might be too high or too low, and so what we need to equilibrate them in such a way that the expenditure of the agents to get to these utility levels actually needs to be equal to their money endowment. And if they are, we're in the equilibrium in the original economy. So how are we going to do that? Well, as I mentioned, we're going to apply the Walrasian auctioneer argument, or a fixed point argument, to balance the utility.
Alex, if expenditure is equal to money endowment, then consumption money is equal to 0. And that gives you the minimum utility level.
No, I'm not sure why you say that. I don't think
expenditure. So if I have $10 and my expenditure is $10, the final amount of money I consume is 0. And if my monetary consumption is 0, my utility is negative infinity.
So this is the value of the endowment, right? Let me just show you kind of how this will work. Maybe it will become clear in a moment, right? So I mean, maybe the next bullet point is the one that's going to kind of clarify this. Okay, so let's say that we so as I said, we're going to apply this fixed point argument, and so suppose we start with a very high utility level for a particular agent, right? What this says is that the expenditure that is necessary to be able to get to that utility level is basically too high relative to the endowment that this agent actually has in the first place, right? The value of the endowment that the agent has, right? And so what I want to do is I want to lower that utility level to make sure that the expenditure that's required to get to that utility level is closer to the endowment that they have, okay? And vice versa, I might also have a utility level for a particular agent that is very low. And then what I want to do is I want to raise it in order to make sure that the agent is not underspending, that the agent is not left with additional resources, right? They could spend in order to improve their utility. Now there's a kind of maybe a interesting kind of technical point is, how exactly do you determine that high level? And we actually recycled some of the tricks that we used in another paper to be able to actually say what are the minimum and the highest level of utility that an agent can achieve. So we know the lower utility level, we know where that is. But the high level is determined by giving the total surplus to a particular agent. Remember, we're still in this quasi-linear economy. So we imagine that what the most utility that an agent can get is basically all the possible surplus in the economy, and that gives us an upper bound. And so then as you can see, this is a kind of a fixed point argument. And so in order to be able to apply Kakutani's fixed point theorem, what we need to show is that the set of possible expenditure levels in the Hicksian economy is going to be compact and convex, and that it varies upper hemi-continuously in the utility levels. And
why is it compact? In log utility economy, the range of utility runs from minus infinity to plus infinity. Right.
Correct, but we can still bound what can possibly happen, right? So you again, so remember, you are not looking at this in the original economy, right? You're looking at this in the Hicksian economy, which is a quasi-linear economy, right?
Yeah.
So you're not interested in the range of utilities in the original one. You're actually seeing what can happen in this TU economy. In this TU economy, you can actually do this, right? And this is how that's why there's meaning to giving total surplus, right? You can really say what is the maximum surplus that you can generate in the transferable utility economy.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it turns out, this is why this exercise is doable, is because really we're using the transferability of utility very seriously here to be able to create these bounds. But really, none of these steps are completely straightforward. Neither the compactness or the convexity are actually immediate. So there's quite a bit of work to be done. Once this is all set up, it's then a consequence of Kakutani's fixed point theorem. So I hope this is, while it's, quote unquote, just Kakutani, I think the reason why it's interesting is because the argument is not one where we apply Kakutani on prices, which as a proof, I'm sure many of you have seen in sort of, graduate microsequence that we typically show to our students, or it's not the same as Nigishi's beautiful result, which is adjusting welfare weights. This is actually using utility levels directly. And so that's a kind of technical novelty here. So maybe
just a very quick clarification. So again, so when you said in the first bullet point, you wrote that is a sort of condition you need is that the expenditure is equal to money endowment for all agents. But by this money endowment, you did not mean the X0. It's the monetary valuation of the
value.
Okay, just checking.
So everything, this is slightly unclear actually. So everything is really becomes converted into the monetary value. That's really how because we're now in this transferable utility economy, right? I can just talk about the kind of monetary value of things and they're now directly comparable. Yeah.
Thank you.
So remember, Hicksian valuation is a money term. And so I have a Hicksian valuation, it's measured in dollars or yen, minus some expenditure, which is also measured in yen.
Thank you.
Great. So now let me show you why the equilibrium existence duality is so powerful. We've already seen that by reinterpreting Hicksian demand as a quasi-linear maximization problem, we can see that the assignment game and the housing market are related. We might say that the assignment game is like a dual of the housing market. But now let's apply the equilibrium existence duality to this. Now we know that equilibrium exists in the assignment game by almost the first argument I gave in the first lecture, right? By linear programming argument, we know that in the assignment game equilibrium exists, result due to Koopmans and Beckman and Chaplin-Shubik. And then what this tells us is that because the assignment game and the housing market are linked by the quasi-linear interpretation of Hicksian demand, it must be the case that equilibrium must exist in the housing market economy by the equilibrium existence duality. Because the economies are dual, the equilibria, or the existence of equilibria, is also going to kind of, if you like, be dual, right? To kind of satisfies this duality. So what it means is that we don't even, having done the equilibrium existence duality proof, we no longer need to prove or give a separate proof for the existence of equilibrium in the housing market. We can just infer it directly from equilibrium existence in the assignment game. And we immediately get this much more sophisticated result of the equilibrium existence in the housing market. Okay, and here perhaps I'm just giving a kind of a hint here. Remember what I said, that all the proofs in the housing market economy required a topological argument. Here, of course, there is also a topological argument, and it sits inside the equilibrium existence duality, right? So while the assignment game equilibrium proof does not require topological arguments, it's that move from the top left corner to the top right corner where you know, Kakutani's fixed point theorem actually kind of plays a key role. So it's not surprising then that the other papers that have used it have proved this result also used different types of topological arguments. Okay, so I'm not by any means trying to claim, for example, that you can do a constructive proof of existence in the housing market. Okay, so that's one example. So I hope at least on this example things are clear. Perhaps I should pause again to ask if there's questions. If not, then I'm going to move to the example of substitutes and walk you through that.
Alex?
Super. Yeah.
So I'm under the impression that you can prove second welfare theorem.
Yes.
So you're coming to this point later?
I'm actually not. No, I'm laughing because the very first draft that we wrote, and this is the Maskin and Roberts connection, it actually wasn't stated as a duality even. We really thought about them as three separate results. And if you actually look at the proof that we did in the paper, it goes via a result on efficiency of equilibrium as well.
So if that's true, maybe you can get alternative proof by using Negishi approach.
Perhaps. So
okay.
It's not exactly obvious how to do it still. So we definitely thought about it. It wasn't obvious to us. I would be delighted if somebody has an idea of how to do it in an alternative way using Negishi's approach, because there's certainly a connection to the second welfare theorem.
Okay, second question. Is the existence of continuous commodity, money, is it essential for the existence of equilibrium? If you have very simple housing exchange market without money, Wallacean equilibrium exists. TTC allocation is Wallacean allocation. So there is a hope to get existence even without money. And the result in housing exchange economy, the existence of Wallacean economy, Wallacean equilibrium, and your result, are those two observations totally separated, or is it somehow connected to your?
So the question is fantastic because it's going to be at the core of what Ravi is going to talk about tomorrow. So here we're using divisibility of money very strongly in the proof, right? I'm not claiming that there aren't insights you can do beyond that. We're definitely using divisibility of money. It turns out that once you also have, again, I apologize for the terminology, hard budget constraints, where you can literally hit the budget constraint, not like here, right? Price flexibility turns out to be very important. So actually being able to, Ravi will give you many examples tomorrow of where divisibility of money plays a completely central role for a lot of the results. And this is again, actually in a matching setting. So I think we still don't know everything that there is to know about this. So I think there are a bunch of open questions about to what extent divisible money is important. I think it's a reasonable assumption. So from a modeling point of view, I would defend it. But from a technical point of view, I think we're not entirely sure. And your example of TTC is very good, right? But in particular, hopefully with the application to substitutes, you will see that we can go far beyond that. And actually, once you have TTC in kind of settings with multiple goods, things become a bit more complicated, right?
Okay.
So what I'm about to show you, I don't think is going to work if you don't have money.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so to keep things simple for this part of the talk, let me assume that the there is basically at most one unit of each good, okay, of the indivisible goods. It will keep things simple. This is just for this talk to state the assumptions as simply as possible. In the paper, this is completely not required. So nothing at all relies on this. None of the insights I will show you rely on this, but it will keep the definitions a little bit shorter. Okay, so one unit of each good. So let's recall a definition of substitutability. I'll walk you through it again. And so now let's think about the definition of preferences being substitutes in an environment in which we allow for income effects. Okay, so as I said, I think in our paper with Tomasz Flajner, Zsuzsa Janko, and Ravi, we probably gave the kind of the main formal definition of this, but really it's very similar to what happens in Kelso and Crawford. So utility function is gross substitutable at a particular endowment if, for all money endowments, price vectors, and a change, the following thing happens. If I start out at a point where demand is single valued, I demand one particular bundle, and I increase the price of good I, and I move to another bundle, it better be the case that the demand for all the other goods whose price hasn't changed has weakly increased. Okay, so as I said, in other words, if I increase the price of one good, it better be the case that the demands for all the other goods weakly increases. Okay, now remember that if I have quasi-linear utility, that is, I can express everything in terms of valuations, then there is no distinctions between gross and net, and so we can simply talk about substitutability. So if you go back to my first lecture, I was quite careful to not call things gross substitutable when we were in a transferable utility setting, okay? And indeed, the condition itself is not going to depend on the endowment, so I can just strike out the W terms completely and keep the definition exactly the same. Okay, so if I just, crossed out at an endowment if for all money endowments part, and then struck out the W from the Marshallian demand, and even got rid of subscript M, right? I don't need subscript Marshallian because in a transferable utility setting, I can just talk about demand. I will have a definition of substitutes valuations, which you had seen in the first lecture. Now, let's apply the...
Alex, very minor question. Yes. So in this definition, you have subscript K, and is K possible? Is it possible that K is equal to 0, so that XK prime means so XK means amount of money, monetary consumption, or K is strictly greater than 0?
Sorry, so if a price of a particular good goes up,
yeah,
I need to think about this for a moment.
Yeah.
I think we're just thinking about indivisible goods here. So, because
is...
sorry, it's because we're really just thinking, right? So the demand, the Marshallian demand is just for indivisible goods, right? We're not even paying attention to what the numeraire is doing.
Okay, fine, yeah.
So it's really just one onwards.
Okay, yeah.
Great. So, so now let me give you a definition of net substitutability. Okay, it's exactly the same definition as on the previous slide, except I have substituted for all money endowments by for all utility levels, and I've substituted subscript M for Marshallian by subscript H for Hicksian. Okay, it's exactly the same definition. It says that for all utility levels, if the price of a good goes up, it better be the case that the Hicksian demand for all the other goods weekly goes up. Okay, now let's first use our lemma, the quasi-linear interpretation of Hicksian demand. It tells us that we can simply replace a valuation with a Hicksian valuation in the definition of substitutability, and this will give us a definition of net substitutability, right? So that's immediate. We know that these two things are going to be dual to one another. But then they can now apply the equilibrium existence duality. So from the results of Kelso and Crawford and Gould and Sticchetti, we know that under substitutability, equilibrium exists in transferable utility economies. And therefore, by the equilibrium existence duality, we can go from the top left corner to the top right corner. We then know that under net substitutability, equilibrium exists with income effects. And so this gives us our theorem. In a sense, it's a corollary of the equilibrium existence duality, right? This is a two-line proof. You have just seen the two-line proof. Under net substitutability, equilibrium exists for all endowment allocations. Okay. So now the question might be, well, okay, this is nice, but is this actually more general than gross substitutability in the world with income effects? I had already indicated in my first lecture that, and earlier today, that gross substitutability is a strong condition when you have income effects. And one might ask whether net substitutability is going to be weaker. And so here's the good news. It is that if there is an endowment of goods at which the utility function is gross substitutable, then it is going to be net substitutable. So in other words, we know that net substitutability is strictly more general than gross substitutability. And the converse is not true. You might worry that the converse is true, but the converse is actually not true. And it's very easy to see this from the housing market example. So I went through this example in the first lecture. Let me go through it again for completeness. So suppose we have an agent in this economy called Martine, and she owns a house. And she's thinking about selling her house and either buying a fancy house or a mediocre house. Now, if the price of her house goes up, what might happen is that Martine might stop demanding the mediocre house and switch to only demanding the fancy house. And this, of course, violates gross substitutability. The price of a good, that is her house, has gone up, but the demand for the other good, which is the mediocre house, has now gone down. Now, it's, I hope, kind of straightforward to see, right, that if you fix Martine's utility level and think about price changes here, her preferences definitely satisfy net substitutability. She only demands at most one house. So at a fixed utility level, once you compensate her for the price change, then she is obviously going to still satisfy substitutability because she wants at most one house. So here, Martine's preferences satisfy net substitutability, and so indeed, the housing market example is a kind of a corollary of the result that you just saw on the previous slide, which is that under net substitutability, competitive equilibria always exist. And let me give you kind of the broad intuition for why this result is true. Really, what's going on when you are defining gross substitutability is that you put in two constraints. You put in a constraint on the substitution effect, that is what happens in fixing utility level, what happens when you change a price of a good for the demand of the other goods, but you also put in constraint on the income effect. You're worried that the agent's income has changed because of the price change. And so you need to put in two simultaneous conditions. And as I indicated in the first lecture, if you put these two together, actually they look very strong. So in particular, they look like they imply that goods really need to be inferior. But net substitutability does not place conditions on income effects, it only places conditions on the substitution effects. And so it's therefore not surprising that in fact, net substitutability is more general. Okay. So it simply requires fewer constraints in that definition. Okay. Now, recall from the first lecture, I mentioned this marvelous result that substitutability is in fact a maximal domain of preferences for existence of equilibrium. This was a beautiful result due to Gould and Stiketty. And so what we can do is we can kind of use the reverse direction of the equilibrium existence duality. Really, so far we've been saying if an equilibrium exists in a transferable utility economy, then it exists in an original economy. We can now go backwards and say what happens in the original economy then always exists in the TU economy. And then we can basically restate Gould and Stiketty's result, except now we can add the phrase net substitutable instead of substitutable. So if there is an agent whose utility function is not net substitutable, then there are going to be substitutable valuations for other agents, and an endowment allocation will be able to find them, construct them, such that no equilibrium is going to exist. So you basically can't step strictly outside of the domain of net substitutable preferences. Okay.
Alex,
Yeah.
it's the clarification, but do you know whether there's any hope for getting a result like this for fixed endowment allocation? So if I understand correctly, the way you use this, the equivalence relies on being able to choose endowment allocation. So, but if anything, some other argument might be needed. But
I'm not very confident about this. Yeah, I don't think so. But I can't give you kind of a definitive reason. But from doing this, it doesn't seem very likely.
I was thinking about this the other day, Alex. If everyone's got quite strong income effects, and we give everything, all the full endowment of the world to me, and so I've got quite strong income effects, so now you're going to have to pay me quite a lot of money to buy these things off me, and everybody else has got a tiny bit of money and no goods. Nobody can afford to buy anything off me. So an equilibrium exists. But that doesn't tell us anything about whether an equilibrium would exist if the endowment was more equitable in the first place. So in a sense, the existence of an equilibrium for a single endowment doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the existence of equilibrium for more general endowments.
Okay, I think that's pretty fair. Okay, I mean, Fuhito, it sounds like we're still, yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that we haven't settled yet. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth's example is very good. So and just to kind of reiterate exactly what this says about the economies with income effects, when previously we were thinking about proving this result for gross substitutability, we were just simply wrong. I mean, we had an idea, a few years ago that perhaps gross substitutability could be this maximal domain, and we couldn't get this result. And the reason why we couldn't get it is because it wasn't true, because it turns out that actually net substitutability is the most general way to incorporate income effects and to guarantee existence. Okay. So now let me tell you something a bit more about net substitutability before I kind of wrap up with a few more examples and connect it to Elizabeth's work. It's really to underline the difference between net substitutability and gross substitutability. I've already told you that net substitutability is more general. And in fact, net substitutability allows for the presence of gross complementarities, right? Because it does not place any conditions on income effect, in principle, it allows you to have both gross substitutes and gross complements. And in fact, it also tells you that agents who, one agent might have gross substitutable preferences over some goods, and another agent might have gross complementary preferences over some goods, and yet equilibrium will always exist, right? So this is kind of a remarkable thing, because typically if you go all the way back to my first lecture, we had the first counterexample of equilibrium failing. You saw the reiteration of this example in Elizabeth's lecture, where the two lips would cross at this awkward point. What happened there is that there was an agent with substitutes valuation and an agent with complements valuation. And one had substitutes valuation and the other one had complements valuations over the same goods. Now, this result, of course, is still correct. But what we're saying here is that, in fact, once you have income effects, it's perfectly okay for agents to have gross substitutable and gross complementary preferences over the same goods. Equilibrium is not going to fail to exist. What is not allowed to happen is that agents have net substitutable and net complementary preferences over the same goods, right? Because remember, gross and net is exactly the same when you're in a transferable utility setting. And so what's I think kind of exciting about this is that we're uncovering a class of economies in which we now see equilibrium existence with both substitutes and complements happening over the same goods at the same time. And I think that's quite new. So let me kind of show you why it's, I think, particularly interesting on a very simple example, and what this in particular means for auction design also. So let's suppose I have 3 agents in this economy. There's a seller who owns both goods, and the seller is quasi-linear, just has valuation 0. It's kind of like a dummy agent. And then I have 2 buyers. And now these buyers are going to have quasi-logarithmic preferences. So they have $10 to spend, and the buyers are going to have exactly the same utility functions. So things are going to be very simple. And the utility functions are going to look like this. They're going to be like log of money minus the log of 10 minus xi, which is the whether or not you consume the good 1. Remember, there's at most 1 unit. Minus 3 of x2, which is whether or not you consume good 2, right? Again, there's only 1 unit. Okay, so you have at most $10. So if you have these log preferences in particular, what it turns out that if you were to draw a lip in this world, so remember, this is going to be the locus of prices at which the agent is indifferent between 2 bundles. You saw these lips yesterday in Elizabeth's lecture. Now I'm trying to draw a lip in the presence of income effects, right? It's going to look like the red lines that you see on the picture below. So if your prices are very, very high, the agent is not going to demand anything. If the price of good 1 is very high, the agent is just going to demand good 2. If the price of good 2 is very high, the agent is just going to demand good 1. But if the prices are low enough, the agent is going to demand both goods. Now, here is an interesting thing that you might observe immediately, is that this lip has a very interesting shape. So this agent has essentially, if you like, if you were to take out the income effects, this agent would just have separable preferences. Okay, so if you took these preferences and thought about what they should look like in a world with no income effects, they would just be completely separable, which means that you would expect the lip to look like a cross from Elizabeth's lecture yesterday. Now you can see this lip does not look like a cross. And in fact, one portion of it, if you look at the lip that connects the region where the agent demands only good 1 and the region where the agent demands, say, only the bundle 1 and 2 together, you see that this lip is sloping downward, which means that this agent it looks like a lip that describes complementary valuations. So at this point, as I will show you at the moment, actually the agent views goods as being gross complements. Okay, so let's see exactly why this is the case. So first of all, let me say that in this very, very simple economy, there is a unique equilibrium price vector, and it's denoted in the picture by 6 and 3. So this is the magenta point in the middle. But in particular, if you try to run an auction to try to find it, it's not going to work. So how might we use an auction to find this equilibrium? Well, we will start at 0, 0, and at this point, both goods are going to be demanded by both agents. So both goods are going to be over demanded, and we will have to increase the price of both goods. And we're going to have to do this until we hit this lip, this lip that connects the region where good 1 is demanded and the bundle 1, 2 is demanded. Now, at this point, as you will see, actually the price of good 2 is already too high. We've already missed the equilibrium because we know that the equilibrium price vector must be at 6, 3. Why has this happened? We know that if agents have substitutes valuations, or in fact, if agents have gross substitutes, ascending auctions definitely work. So we should have been able to find the equilibrium. So what's going on here? Why doesn't it work with net substitutable preferences? Well, it's because the agent's utility function, the buyer's utility function, while it is net substitutable, it is actually not gross substitutable. So if you look at what happens when price of good 1 changes from something like 4.4 to 4.5, we basically cross that lip roughly where not far from where the blue line touches it, and we go along the x coordinate. What happens is that we're increasing the price of good 1, we're crossing that lip, and we stop demanding good 2. Now, of course, as you saw in Elizabeth's lectures yesterday, that is an example of complementary preferences, to be more precise here, of gross complementary preferences. And so indeed, preferences of the agents do not satisfy gross substitutes. So what's, I think, kind of remarkable here is that in the first lecture, I gave you this idea that substitutability is intimately connected to being able to find equilibrium by using a Teytelboym argument, right? A kind of an auction argument where I can adjust prices monotonically and get to equilibrium. And here, agents' preferences do satisfy net substitutability, and yet this disconnect is completely apparent. You really cannot get to equilibrium in a monotonic way here at all. And yet we know that equilibrium exists. There is just, it really is right there. So it's probably worth pausing here and let this point perhaps sink in for a moment and just check whether anybody has any questions, because maybe there was a lot of things going on.
So I'm not sure if I'm asking the right question or not, but let me try. So given this equivalence, so to speak, this existence duality thing, can you think of a Hicksian economy and find out, like run some ascending auction in that economy and find a price, or is it not as easy as that? Or
yeah, so that would be the kind of the hope, right? But the problem is so you could do that, except that once you go back to the Marshallian economy, you are not going to find that the price, prices are going to move in a nice monotonic way, because you're probably going to run this argument on, so it like a price movement in the Hicksian economy does not translate to a nice price movement in the original economy. Yeah. So they don't look the same.
Okay, I see.
Because in the Hicksian economy, you are this was a kind of, I think our original hope was exactly that. But this would also then tell you that you should be able to construct equilibria in basically any market with income effects in which equilibrium exists, right? So you should be able to do a kind of so whenever you could run a monotonic argument in the case when there are no income effects, you then be able to run a monotonic argument when there are income effects. And that seems quite a tall order, right? Given at least the example of the housing market. In particular, this will tell you should be able to prove the existence of equilibrium in the housing market with income effects by using a constructive argument. And that seems unlikely.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
So I think the thing that I really want you to take away from this picture is that, well, maybe somewhat trivially, you can, if you have log-log preferences, then actually the geometry of preferences, even with income effects, is very nice. They're still straight lines. And that's really lovely because it makes constructing examples very easy. So we reuse this, Ravi will show you how we reuse this functional form elsewhere because it's so nice. It also tells you that there is actually a fundamental disconnect between existence and Teytelboym, even when you have substitutes. So I think the sort of the paradigm which I set up in the first lecture, which I think is the dominant paradigm in the literature for markets with indivisible goods, is that once you have substitutes, you can run constructive arguments, you can run a monotonic auction and get to equilibrium. And this actually tells you that you might not. And the reason is that what Teytelboym depends on is gross substitutability. That's really what you need. And net substitutability allows for the presence of gross complements. And once you throw gross complements into the mix, it makes it, essentially impossible to find equilibrium with a monotonic auction.
So are you going to show some alternative methods to find equilibrium, or is it still a kind of open question?
Absolutely open. In fact, that, as you will see, will be the very last bullet point on the very last slide.
Thank you.
I have one comment. So suppose everybody has same utility function, and the preference is homothetic and net substitutable. Okay, and if that condition is true, you can construct a representative consumer, and the aggregate demand is equal to the demand of the representative consumer. If you have, everybody has same net substitutable homothetic preferences, right? And then aggregate demand satisfies weak action, and therefore Tatoman converges. That's Masquerade Winston Green.
Yes, no, I think so. For the divisible
this
good
is a
case,
very restricted domain.
Absolutely, yeah.
But so there is a hope to get Tatoman convergence without, maybe without using gross substitutability. Existence of a representative consumer.
So I think that's fair. It does seem like the gross substitutability and warp are kind of both very strong, right, in that world. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that what we've done is that we've given conditions for existence, and I think there are restrictions that you might be able to place that are going to be additional, that might be able to recover Tatoman here. My hunch, honestly, is that whatever restrictions you will place in this world is going to take you so close to gross substitutability that it might not be, it would be very surprising if you can be far away from gross substitutability and still.
Oh, weak axiom conditioning is very different from gross substitution. No.
I mean, okay.
So if you have only one consumer, whatever preference this guy has, Tatoman always converges. That's because this guy's demand satisfies weak action, right? So one efficient condition is something like gross substitutability. The other condition is something like the existence of representative consumer. But I agree with you that those two conditions are very strong.
Very strong. Yeah. Sorry. So what I meant to say is that you might have another very restrictive condition. It might not be worth it, relative. So right. When I meant close is kind of in terms of how much it can capture in terms of the economy, right? Yes. We should probably look into this actually. Kind of think about what warp actually means in this setting. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me, I'm running slightly over. Let me just give you a couple of further applications and I'll wrap up just so you can see how much further we can take equilibrium existence duality, not just for substitutes, but elsewhere. So remember, here is the general way in which we can construct new domains. So we start in the bottom left as some condition on demand or on valuations that are going to give us equilibrium existence in a transferable utility economy. So we can use the entire literature on this. And then what we can do is we can, first of all, transform the preferences, or not reinterpret the preferences really, that are placed on a quasi-linear utility function as a condition on Hicksian demand, typically by sticking the word net in front of it or putting in subscript h into the valuation. And then by the equilibrium existence duality, this immediately tells us that equilibrium will exist with income effects under this relaxed condition with, that we will have written down. So in particular, we can take even unusual conditions. So in the first lecture, I covered a paper by Ozan Jandagan, Asu Ozdaglar, and Pablo Perillo, which represented preferences as a kind of valuation graph where the bundle would be valued as a sum of the valuations of the nodes and the edges. And it sort of seemed like a bit of an abstract condition, but I think actually it was quite easy to interpret, right? It was that this graph cannot have cycles, and it also better be the case that agents pairwise view goods as substitutes or pairwise view them as complements. Other than that, there were no restrictions. So if valuations had that structure, then equilibrium would always exist. That's what that paper shows. I can immediately tell you what the equivalent result is in the case of with income effects. It says that if Hicksian valuations satisfy that condition, then we're going to have equilibrium existence with income effects. So you automatically, for free, get the generalization results to the case with income effects. And in the paper, we also explain how to apply this result to a very beautiful recent paper by Marzena Rostek and Nathan Yoder as well, who really focus on complements entirely. And so to wrap up, let me just mention the connection of this work to Elizabeth's lecture yesterday. So recall what Elizabeth showed yesterday. It's one direction of the beautiful unimodularity theorem that she presented, was that if we have that agents have a concave valuation of a unimodular demand type, then we have equilibrium existence under in a transferable utility setting, right? So remember that Elizabeth imposed two conditions, right? One of them was that valuations are concave, and the other one was that the demand type is unimodular, and this gave us existence. And what Elizabeth argued is that actually this unimodularity condition allows you to have very broad classes of complements, right? Far beyond just having substitutes or basis changes of substitutes. Now, what we can do, we can reinterpret the quasi-linear interpretation of this condition is that the agents have quasi-concave utility functions, which are also of a unimodular demand type. So in particular, Elizabeth yesterday talked about the substitutes demand type. So we still have the substitutes demand type, except now in this case, it's going to capture net substitutes. And the strong substitutes demand type is going to cover strong net substitutes. And what this does is that this turns out to give us an equivalent unimodularity theorem with income effects in in the setting that I described. And what's remarkable, and I mentioned this paper at the beginning by Danilov, Koshova, and Morota, is that this direction, this sufficiency direction of this theorem, in fact, is present in their paper. So indeed, what they showed, their assumptions on the economy actually allowed for income effects. And in fact, their version of the unimodularity theorem also allowed for income effect. And so we give our equilibrium existence duality gives us an immediate proof of this general result by using the Elizabeth and Paul's formulation. Now, it's worth saying
Alex,
how, yeah, sorry.
Clarifying question. So let me just try to understand what's written in red fonts. So my understanding is you construct Hicksian variation from a cost minimizing problem. And this Hicksian variation is of unimodular demand type. Is that what you mean? But or you are just directly looking at the original utility, quasi-concave utility function, and somehow
so you can do both, right? Because you can go between the Hicksian valuation and the utility function, right? Completely. So there's no reason to. So if you prefer, everything that Elizabeth said yesterday could have been said by, instead of by saying valuation, could have been said with Hicksian valuation. And everything goes through except the interpretation, the economic interpretation of the conditions is different. So when Elizabeth said that the strong substitutes demand type describes strong substitutes valuations, what I now say is strong substitutes demand type describes strong net substitutable utility functions. Okay, so they allow for income effects.
Related question. The special case is net substitutable variation, right? And for quasi-linear case, we know a direct condition on variation function, which is equivalent to substitutability. That's M natural concavity by Morota. Now, suppose we have this red condition. All Hicksian variations are M natural concave.
Absolutely.
So what is the condition on the original utility function? Is there any simple, compact definition or so easy to check sufficient condition to guarantee that all Hicksian variations of M natural concave? Do you understand my question?
I don't know about check. So the formalism is exactly as you say. So you can just say that Hicksian variations satisfy M natural concavity. I think the easiest way to interpret them is to say the agent's preferences satisfy net substitutability.
Okay.
So the way you check
because
them
M natural concavity is the same thing as strong substitutability.
Yeah.
They're equivalent.
So you can just say
The
that
strong one with the one-to-one trade-offs.
I'm sorry, so with strong, yeah. So in the general case, it's with strong, right? So
No, I don't. Yeah.
So what you can do is you can basically say, okay, I'm going to look at compensated price changes and check whether the demand changes go in the same direction, in the appropriate direction for net substitutability.
Yeah, but it would be nice if you just look at variation utility function without deriving demand or compensated demand. If you're just looking at the shape of utility function, that's M flat concavity, right? You don't derive demand. You just look at the utility function, and if it satisfies M natural concavity condition, that's equivalent to substitutability.
So I still
if there are anything similar applicable for this red condition.
So
nice.
I don't need to derive demand, right? I just need to convert the utility function into a Higgsine valuation, and then I can do the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but that's all. I think that's all we know. I think because the income effects do, make things right trickier. So I don't think that we can say much beyond what I've said to you just now.
Yeah. Thank you.
And please, Elizabeth, if I've missed anything, but I think that covers the whole thing that we know at the moment.
Yes, so in particular, we haven't thought about conditions that are framed in the same way as M natural concavity is framed, because that's just not the way we've been thinking about things. There may be a very nice way to present it like that looks more like Morota's work, but we just haven't thought about that.
It's exactly right. It's absolutely possible. And I think we've really leveraged that shortcut of going to the Higgsine valuations and just worked in the quasi-linear world. But I really hope that it's possible to do something like this, right? To give kind of more compact representations of these things. So I really encourage people to think about this and email us if you have any ideas or work on it by yourself as you wish. So I just want to kind of really stress how much more equilibrium existence duality and our approach kind of does relative to Daniel, Kojima, and Morota. One of them is what Elizabeth already mentioned yesterday, which is that we give a very clear interpretation for what unimodularity of a demand type really means here, right? Because we understand that demand types capture comparative statics of Higgsine demand, we can really say very clearly what the different demand types are and what comparative statics of capture. Now here, note of Higgsine demand, right? And so this really connects this unimodularity work to very basic elementary concepts in economics. And I think that there's, hopefully you would agree, there's some value in that. The other thing to mention is that the equilibrium existence duality goes in both directions. So in the same way as we were able to give a maximal domain result for the case of net substitutes, we can also give a maximal domain results for the unimodularity setting with income effects, right? So again, the equilibrium existence duality always gives you that ability of going in the other direction to both get existence and maximal domain, as well as the economic interpretation.
Actually, I was about to ask about that the other direction. So when you say this unimodularity as a maximal domain, do you mean that again? This condition on the right, bottom right condition would be maximal domain when you say for existence for all possible endowment. Is that what you're going to say?
Yes. So again, with the caveat that Elizabeth has pointed out, but that's the statement is going to look very similar to the statement in the case of net substitutes, except we would say that an agent's valuation is not of a unimodular demand type, then we can construct, etc.
Okay, I see. So now the free parameter would be the economy's entire endowment plus the endowment allocation. Okay, thank you.
And so just to give you one last application, and then I will promise to finish, we can also take the conditions which are go in both directions, right? So in a sense, the condition that Elizabeth presented yesterday, as she showed you, goes in both directions. And there are other conditions for existence in TU economies, which also go in both directions, which I presented in my first lecture. And one of them, you remember, was this formulation of the integer programming formulation of Bicchandani and Mama. So if there is a necessary and sufficient condition in the TU world, we can first give the economic interpretation in terms of Hicksian valuations or in terms of Hicksian demand, and we can also guarantee equilibrium existence. So to really wrap up on this note, you remember, I hope, the integer programming formulation that said that if we write down this integer program, which is really described in the statement of the corollary, except I did not have Hicksian valuations in there. The result of Bicchandani and Mama said that if that integer program has an integer optimum, then a competitive equilibrium exists. If and only if. So competitive equilibrium exists if and only if the integer program has an integer optimum. Now, all I need to do here is to replace valuations with Hicksian valuations and to say that this result needs to hold for all profiles of utility levels, and the same result basically immediately goes through. Now, you might say this is perhaps a harder condition to check because I require that it needs to be done for all utility levels, but nevertheless, it's still done in terms of the same elementary objects that were given in Bicchandani and Mama, right? So it's the same integer program, except I'm replacing valuation with Hicksian valuation. So just to wrap up, and this is my last slide. We did kind of use duality in two ways, right? The first way is that was probably very familiar to almost everybody on this call. We used it in a consumer theory sense to separate income and substitution effects. And that allows us to get a lot of mileage in analyzing equilibrium in markets with income effects. In particular, this was our quasi-linear interpretation of Hicksian demand, which turns out to be very powerful in this setting. Now, what this approach allows us to do is to, first of all, create Hicksian economies, develop the equilibrium existence duality, which says that an equilibrium exists in all Hicksian economies, if and only if it exists in the original economy, and then allows us to go between the transferable utility setting and settings with income effects, and take any condition for existence in the transferable utility world and give a analogous result for the case with income effects. And in particular, conceptually, what this says is that substitution effects are driving whether or not equilibria exist or not. So you give me a condition that gives me existence in a setting with income effects, I will be able to write it, or a weaker condition in terms of substitution effects alone. But as you saw in the example where we had net substitutes preferences, but the potential presence of gross complements, income effects do matter for finding equilibrium. So in particular, running an ascending auction in the case of net substitutes might look very different from running an ascending auction in the case of gross substitutes. And so this does raise a question of whether you actually want to run ascending auctions in these settings, or whether maybe there is ways of running sealed bid auctions. And so tomorrow we'll show you some more applications of this idea in the context of matching markets. And in that world, what Ravi will show is that even if you have this quote unquote hard budget constraint where you can really you can go all the way down to your minimum level of money and you can run out of money, you might not have equilibrium, but you will still have stable matchings. And you will see the role that price flexibility plays there. So that's kind of one application. The other application comes a bit more from market design, which is that we now have a way, because now we have a general way of thinking about equilibrium in the setting with income effects. In this, we might hope that there might be bidding languages that would allow us to design package auctions with financing constraints, right? So in the same way as the Elizabeth's lecture yesterday, equilibrium existence was intimately connected to the bidding, the dot bid bidding language that is used by the Bank of England. One would hope that by understanding when equilibrium works in the setting with income effects, you would be able to design other bidding languages for cases where there are also financing constraints. And as one of the audience members, I'm sorry I didn't catch who this was, asked a really good question about, will you give us an algorithm for finding equilibria? I didn't, because it's an open question to us, is both the complexity of the finding a precise equilibrium as precisely as possible, and kind of good algorithms for approximating equilibrium or finding the equilibrium exactly. So all of these computational questions are still open, and of course I encourage people to work on them. Thank you.